We both consider tomatoes one of our favorite foods.
We eat them in salads, on pizza, and tomato sauce, year-round. Our families both grow tomatoes.
We wanted to research where the tomatoes we buy really come from, whether organically or conventionally grown.
First, we went to major grocery stores representing different consumers.
We talked to Whole Foods, PCC, Metropolitan Market, the Seattle Co-op, Trader Joe's, QFC, Top, Safeway, Uwajimaya, and the Asian Food Center.
Then we visited the downtown Bellevue Farmers Market and looked at tomatoes grown in Ellensburg and LaConner, Washington. Looking at on-the-vine tomatoes, we recorded where they were grown, how much they cost per pound, and how far they traveled to get from the hothouse to Interlock High School.
We found that out of the 14 tomatoes we looked at in stores, 12 came from the same 3 tomato growers, either Village Farms, Howlings, or Origin O. These 3 tomato growers are all located in Delta, Canada, only 200 kilometers away from Bellevue, Washington.
In fact, most of the tomatoes grown in British Columbia came from Delta, which is close to Vancouver. And seeing as many of these tomatoes came from the same patch of land, we found that it wasn't necessarily more expensive to buy your tomato from Whole Foods or cheaper to buy from Safeway. It makes sense. Many stores here get their produce from the same wholesaler, and because of Washington's proximity to British Columbia, many of our tomatoes are from Canada. Ellie and I didn't have much difficulty tracking down the Canadian tomatoes. At the store, we asked to see the cardboard boxes the tomatoes were shipped in, always Delta. At home, we Googled the companies and were able to find plenty of information about the tomatoes' origins.
Tomatoes grown in Canada during the winter are grown in greenhouses using hydroponic systems. A hydroponic system is where the plants are grown without soil. Tomatoes are usually grown in a substrate, like sand or clay balls, that is suspended in nutrient-rich water. When plants are grown hydroponically in a greenhouse, artificial lighting and heating is also necessary. Pros of growing hydroponically include: there is no soil, so no soil depletion or erosion. Less water is used because evaporation is contained by the greenhouse. Release of chemicals can be better controlled, so fewer are used and there's less pollution. It guarantees a stable supply so we can have tomatoes year-round, and the output is 3 times greater than field-grown tomatoes. The cons are: hydroponically grown tomatoes have a much higher rate of salmonella. Setup is much more expensive, and it requires a lot of infrastructure and maintenance, and there are huge electricity costs. All the companies had a surprising amount of information about their commitments to sustainability. Village Farms has an integrated pest management system, uses the CO2 generated by its heaters to grow the tomatoes, and recycles the water it uses 4 times before using it to irrigate nearby field crops. In fact, Village Farm uses 86% less water than the average field-grown operation.
This wealth of information about the Canadian tomatoes was a huge contrast from our research into 2 tomatoes we found grown from Mexico. One of the Mexican tomatoes was in Trader Joe's, which doesn't make this kind of information available. The other Mexico-grown Natura brand tomato didn't have a website. I called QFC and was directed to the Fred Meyer Wholesale in Puyallup, Washington, then to a buyer in Portland, but was unable to get the information there either. I researched instead the tomato industry in Mexico, specifically the labor issues. Most tomatoes in Mexico are grown in Sinaloa and Culiacan. There are some large farms with mechanical harvesters, but the majority of tomato production there is field-oriented. Indigenous workers migrate from region to region with the growing season, paid about $4 to $5 per day. Tens of thousands of these workers are children as young as 5, paid even less. After picking, the tomatoes are sent to packing houses, where the workers are typically women paid $15 a day. Compare this to tomato workers in the US and Canada, who make minimum wage. But many of these workers might also be illegal Mexican immigrants, making less than $8 an hour. And some tomatoes will say they're from Texas or Arizona, but in reality, they were grown and processed in Mexico and relabeled upon entering the US. Every time I read about Mexico-grown tomatoes, I read about worker abuse, poor quality fruit, and dumps of fertilizer and pesticides on the plants and in the water. But funnily enough, the Mexican tomato from QFC was labeled organic. We found that even when tomatoes from Mexico are grown organically, they aren't sustainable because they deplete the soil and require massive amounts of water.
So why does the US import so many Mexican tomatoes? Consumers want tomatoes year-round. Mexico's climate is favorable to tomato plants even in winter, while US farmers are facing the cold. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, makes trade with Mexico and Canada very easy, so that by switching between Mexico and Canada in winter and summer, we get tomatoes even in December. The price is more money and a tomato of poor quality. Many Mexican tomatoes are bred to be more durable and shipped while they're still green, sacrificing taste. Which brings us to the other place where you can get tomatoes, from your local farmer's market. We looked at 2 farms, one organic and one conventional. Interestingly, both are family farms that have been in business for almost 100 years. The Kittitas Valley Farm, which is not organic, doesn't use pesticides, and the Headland Family Farm, which is half organic, half conventional, is also certified as salmon safe. As for cost, both tomatoes cost $4 per pound, which was well within the price range we found in grocery stores.
We thought it was interesting that no matter how the tomatoes were grown and where they were from, they were all roughly the same price. How could this be? We looked at what goes into the final price of the tomato and concluded that there are 4 major factors. 2 are transportation, which is a third of the cost, and social costs for workers. It was never stated, but we concluded that lower labor costs are balanced by higher transportation costs. The other 2 factors are irrigation water, which is often scarce, and genetic manipulation, where hardier tomatoes are encouraged.
Ultimately, we think you should try to buy locally grown tomatoes. That's the best way to have the smallest ecological footprint, aside from growing in your own backyard. If that isn't an option, when you're in the grocery store, look for tomatoes from Canada, or be conscious of where your tomatoes come from. We hope this is interesting and informational and makes you think about where your food's from.